You will not remember what I show you now, and yet I shall awaken memories of love and crime and death.
This year, for Horror Spectacular 22, I kind of want to do something different instead of just doing a whole bunch of horror film reviews. I want to do this. Horror icons, like the actual actors who played the monsters. I'm going to start off with Boris Karloff. As we all know, Boris Karloff, famous for playing the Frankenstein monster in the 1931 Universal picture Frankenstein. Also played Imhotep / Ardith Bey in 1932's The Mummy, once again produced by Universal. But let's learn about the man. And I'm only really going to talk about his horror career, not so much other movies that he played in, because he acted in a lot of movies. Boris Karloff, born William Henry Pratt on November 23, 1887, in Dulwich, Surrey, England. He was the child of a British father and an Indian mother, so he had a slightly darker skin tone than the rest of the kids. He was also bow-legged, had a lisp, and stuttered. As he grew up, he managed to get rid of that stutter, but you can hear the lisp if you watch some of his films. But sadly, both of his parents died at an early age. He was raised by his older siblings and half-sister. Now, not many knew why he actually put the name Boris Karloff as his stage name. Many speculated it came from a mad scientist from a novel called The Drums of Jeopardy, whose name was Boris Karloff with a V, not with F's. Early in his career, he did a whole bunch of stage performances during much of the 1910s in Canada and then soon the United States. He didn't get into Hollywood films until the 20s, and keep in mind there was really no sound yet in Hollywood movies, so silent films. His first film was part of a silent serial called The Lightning Rider. Some of his first roles in Hollywood were portraying Indian, Middle Eastern, or Native American characters due to his darker skin tone. Today, some crackheads out there on Twitter will probably cry about Karloff playing some of these characters, saying he whitewashed these characters even though his mother was fully Indian. Nevertheless, he continued to play villains and other characters, even playing the mob boss in the original film that was called Scarface. By 1930, Karloff had played in 80 films. Something that was done a lot back in the day because it didn't take too much to create films in the 1920s. Budgets were way lower and less time on the cutting floor and didn't really have to worry about sound too much, unlike these days. It was reported, and allegedly while sitting on a bus stop, that Karloff ran into another horror icon, Lon Chaney Jr., who offered Karloff a ride, and on this ride, Chaney advised Karloff to find some different roles to set him apart from everyone else. I think at this time he was getting typecasted. But Karloff's big break, as well as his first official horror film flick, wouldn't happen until he was picked for the role of Frankenstein in James Whale's Frankenstein. Originally Universal producer Carl Laemmle Jr. wanted Bela Lugosi to play the monster, but refused, thinking the role was beneath him. You gotta think he was just coming up playing Dracula. So there was Boris Karloff. And Boris Karloff was only 5'11". I thought he was taller than that. While Lugosi was 6'1" in height. And I think Universal wanted someone tall to play the Frankenstein monster. But Karloff had to wear like 4-inch platform boots that weigh like 11 pounds. So that's probably where he got that walk from. As well as wearing heavy makeup with a bulky costume, making the role demanding and tiring. Nonetheless, as we all know, Frankenstein was a success in 1931, and Karloff's design for Frankenstein's monster was trademarked by Universal, but the real credit goes to Jack P. Pierce, the famous the famous monster makeup design artist. It would take a while for Karloff's stardom really to hit, but he continued to play in horror films such as The Old Dark House. I was about to call it The Dark Horse. It's The Old Dark House, which he had top billing for. Some of you don't know, top billings is the name at the top of the roster for all the actors in that movie. Some of the young kids won't know what that means. He will play Imhotep in 1932's The Mummy, which kind of would put his stardom on the map. Then The Ghoul, a British horror film, The Black Cat. Then the sequel to Frankenstein, Bride of Frankenstein in 1935. Around this time, mainly for this movie, Karloff didn't have to wear a dental plate that made his face appear sunken in the original Frankenstein movie. And he had more lines in this film. But he will star as Frankenstein one more time in The Son of Frankenstein in 1939, but could continue to star in other films about Frankenstein or other Universal horror films such as Abbott and Costello meets Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde as that character in 1952, and as a scientist in The House of Frankenstein in 1944. He was also Boris von Frankenstein in Frankenstein 1970, released in 1958, and he kept starring in horror films until his death in 1968. His last horror film, actually it was his last film altogether, was called The House of Evil, a Mexican-Spanish film that was released 4 years after his death in 1972. To add, he also did various other films with Karloff that started. In 1968, Karloff would pass away from pneumonia. I think he did some recordings with some of the horror anthologies. One of them be called The Tales of the Terror. I think he lent his likeness and name to a comic book company I can't think of at the top of my head right now. And he also started in a film with a young Jack Nicholson in 1963 called The Terror, directed by Roger Corman, who is still producing independent films until this day. Roger Corman, I think Jack Nicholson retired in 2010. In The Terror, Boris Karloff is a French nobleman who kills a baron and his wife and then poses as that baron. Like going back to his last film, he starred in The House of Evil. The movie was actually part of a series of Mexican horror films that Karloff signed off to do. They was filmed like back to back to back while Karloff was ailing in health. He actually couldn't travel to Mexico due to his illness of emphysema, which led up to his pneumonia. He was a heavy smoker, and by that time I think he only had like one lung functioning. And I think in his last role, this House of Evil, he portrayed a dying rich man. Very spot on. He also, during Christmas, liked to play Father Christmas. He dressed up as Father Christmas. I think altogether, Karloff started in 41 horror films, half of them probably being with Universal. He probably did over 200 films with also TV shows and radio shows. The man was a worker. I think he even worked after he had a surgery on the spine to correct it. But Boris Karloff is one of the greatest horror icons in cinema, I will have to say. But there will be more that we'll talk about later on. So tell me what you guys think about Boris Karloff, or even any of his movies that you might have seen in the comments down below.
Is turned loose to strike terror into the hearts of men. To shock women and